So trade must be, obviously, it is the aggregate trade balances that matter, and not bilateral trade balances, as I said. And again, as I mentioned before, aggregate trade balances have very little to do with trade policies like tariffs. Aggregate trade balances are simply determined by the underlying macroeconomic fundamentals of investment and saving. And as a result, we can deduct from all of this, or we can conclude, if you will, that the Trump trade doctrine is basically misguided. It does not tell us exactly what has to happen in order to get rid of the current account deficit that the US faces. What the US has to do, as I said, basically focus on these two macro fundamentals, if you will, of savings and investment. Now, having said that, can the US run this deficit indefinitely? In other words, is it possible for any economy to run a current account deficit indefinitely? And the answer is no, not for any economy. But for the US economy is a special case. Why is it possible for the US economy to experience this deficit indefinitely without actually harming the US economy? Well, there are many reasons. One of the most important reasons, of course, is that the US economy happens to be the largest economy in the world. The US economy happens to be responsible for 25% of world production. So that's huge. That's number one. And number two, the US happens to be using the US dollar as a reserve currency. Therefore, all countries will accept US dollars for payment for their exports to the US. Other countries don't have this luxury. Other countries do not possess a reserve currency. So the US dollar is a reserve currency. It is accepted worldwide. Therefore, the US doesn't have to worry about that. And the third reason why the US has been able to indefinitely experience this trade deficit, if you will, is simply because foreign investors have confidence in the US economy, and as long as foreign investors have confidence in the US economy, they will continue to bring their funds into the US. In other words, the US will never be left out of funds. Funds will always find their way to the US economy, simply because foreign investors have confidence in the US economy. As long as that is the case, then there is no reason why the US should worry about having a deficit on its current account, because the US will always be assured of funds flowing into the US. So this is another reason why that is the case. Now, is the current account deficit a problem? So we have already answered the question why it is possible for the US to experience this deficit indefinitely, unlike other economies. Now, the other question is the deficit a good thing or a bad thing? In other words, is there a possibility for the current account deficit to actually ruin the US economy? Well, the answer to this question is there are benefits to having a current account deficit, and there are costs to actually having a current account deficit. Now, obviously, we have to look at the net benefit. In other words, do the benefits outweigh the cost? That's what's important here. So we can list some of the benefits and some of the costs here very quickly. And some of the benefits, of course, of a current account deficit is that it enables a country to actually consume more than it produces. That's one of the benefits. In other words, it obviously increases the standard of living of a nation. When your consumption increases and when you can actually consume more than you can produce, obviously your standard of living will improve tremendously, and that's exactly what you see in the US. Standard of living in the US is extremely high because consumption is very high. So that's one benefit. It allows you to consume more than your ability to produce goods domestically. Number two, the other benefit, of course, it invites or it attracts a lot of foreign investment here in the US. And what do you think this investment will be doing? What do you think all these funds that will come to the US will be doing? They will be generating jobs, right? So that's another plus for having a current account deficit. In other words, more investment, more jobs, more opportunities for employment, etc. The third benefit, of course, is that it reduces the cost of funds. Meaning interest rates are very low in the US, and the reason why interest rates are very low because the supply of funds is huge versus the demand. And the reason for that is simply because of all of these billions of dollars entering the US economy from outside sources. So that's another plus for the US, keeping the cost of capital very low. And this, again, will augment domestic investment when the cost of funds is very low. So this is another plus. Okay, now what are the minuses of having a trade deficit? Well, there are minuses as well. And one of the minuses, of course, is that you will be incurring foreign debt. By borrowing more from outside, you will be incurring foreign debt because that's what a current account deficit will result in. It will result in more money coming in. It will result in more borrowing. And as a result, you will have to pay for all the funds that you're borrowing from overseas. So the interest that you will pay for servicing your debt will increase, which simply means part of your income now has to be set aside for paying for the money that you're borrowing. In other words, you can't be using that part of your income for other purposes. You gotta simply allocate a portion of your income now for taking care of the foreign debt. So that's an important cost right there of having a trade deficit. The other thing, of course, that a trade deficit would result in is that a lot of your assets now are no longer yours. Domestic assets are obviously purchased by foreign investors. So obviously you're going to be losing a lot of control on a lot of your domestic assets. And that's a problem. Why? Because your future now could be leveraged by foreign decision makers. So that's another problem that we're going to look into. The other problem that a deficit may result in, or the other cost, is that it changes the terms of trade. Now, how does it change the terms of trade? Now, remember how we defined the terms of trade in previous lectures. We said that the terms of trade has to do with the price of exports versus the price of imports, right? Now, the terms of trade will be in your favor when the price of exports increase at a relatively higher rate than the price of imports, right? That's when the terms of trade will be in your favor. Now, when we are running a current account deficit, what happens to the prices of imports versus the prices of exports? When we're running a trade deficit, we are importing a lot more than we are exporting. So the demand for imports increases. The demand for our exports fall. So what will this do to the price of imports and exports? Price of imports will increase because the demand for import has just increased. And what happens to the price of exports? Price of exports would fall. Why? Because we're exporting less. That's what a trade deficit does. A trade deficit simply means that you are importing a lot more than you are exporting. So this will change the terms of trade, not in your favor. Now that's another problem, obviously, of having trade deficits. So all of these things really have to do with the trade deficit, the benefits and the costs. There are obviously benefits and there are costs, but in the realm of things, we always have to look at the net effect. In other words, we've got to weigh the benefits versus the cost to be able to determine whether the current account deficit is basically harmful or beneficial to the US economy. So far, it looks as though it is beneficial, and the reason simply because the benefits happen to outweigh the cost. Otherwise, if the benefits do not outweigh the cost, do you think we will still be having a deficit on our current account? Absolutely not. Why? Because US decision makers will reverse course if they feel that the costs outweigh the benefit. But for now, as I said, the benefits happen to outweigh the cost, and that's one of the reasons why we continue to have this deficit on our current account. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York has undergone certain studies to actually test the validity of this theory, if you will, of current account deficits in the US being beneficial to the US economy. So what did they do? They actually looked at the relationship between the trade deficit and the employment level. And they showed empirically, by looking at data and numbers, that there is a positive relationship between the trade deficit and the employment level. In other words, the trend for the trade deficit and the employment level happen to be coinciding. In other words, the trends happen to be showing a positive relationship between the two, which is a good thing. And this is, as I said, it's empirically tested by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and it has shown that trend, if you will, that positive correlation between the two for the past 15 or 20 years. It really hasn't changed, which is a good thing. In other words, you can look at the trade deficit now for the past 10 years and look at the employment level, especially now. What is happening to the trade deficit? We still have a trade deficit, right? But what is happening to the employment in the US? Probably the employment rate in the US is the strongest that it has ever been. At around probably 3.9%, which is pretty good, which is less than 4%. I guess the full employment rate is probably around 4.2, 4.3, and the unemployment rate in the US is at 3.9, which is a lot lower than the full employment, which is pretty good. But anyway, so this gives you an idea of why the trade deficit for the US has been beneficial so far to the US economy. Now, again, the important equation here, that current account is equal to S minus I, current account is synonymous with net foreign investment. Net foreign investment. So net foreign investment is also equal to S minus I. And net foreign investment, if current account is positive, net foreign investment is positive. If the current account is negative, in other words, deficit, then net foreign investment is also negative. Now, what does this mean? When net foreign investment is positive, that simply means we are investing more abroad than foreigners are actually investing here at home. That's why net foreign investment is positive. We are investing more